afternoon. Welcome everyone to our panel on liberal democracy and multilateralism under pressure. This is our fourth Lisbon Conference, and I would very much like to welcome our speakers for this panel, who are Sheri, Berman, and Charles Powell. Let me first start by introducing our panel speakers. Sheri Berman is professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University in New York. She's a very prominent political scientist that combines history and an interest in European history and politics. And she has published widely on issues such as development of democracy, populism and fascism, as well as history of the left. She also intervenes frequently in newspapers, outlets all over in the US and elsewhere. Her most recent book is Democracy and Dictatorship, from the Ancien Régime to the present day, and it was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Charles Powell is director of the Instituto Elcano in Madrid, an institute that is dedicated to international relations and Spain's role in the world. He is a historian and partly also a political scientist, I would say, and he is the author of one of the best, most respected books on Spanish democracy. He has also researched the role of the monarchy in Spain, and since becoming director of Elcano some years ago, he has been very much interested in researching international relations and the way in which these affect the quality of democracy and how national democracies at the EU level, and in particular the case of Spain, but not only. So these are my two fantastic guests. And let me start. We have a very, very broad topic today, which is, again, liberal democracy and multilateralism under pressure. And let me just start by saying that, of course, we are living in interesting times, as the Chinese would put it, because we are seeing the erosion, I would say, of liberal democracy. And I would put it to my speakers, we are witnessing the erosion of liberal democracy today, as well as multilateralism. We can look at the erosion of liberal democracy by considering how democratic backsliding has been occurring across the globe. And this has been actually measured, and Freedom House, for instance, has published a report saying that we've been going through consecutive years. The last 15 years, there have been consecutive declines in freedom across the globe. This is affecting countries like the United States, Brazil, Austria, so all different areas of the globe. It's not something localized in a particular region. And so there was some debate in political science whether this was an overall phenomenon or not, but I think we are reaching the point where it's inescapable. We are witnessing an erosion and the rise of populism that accompanies this decline in or democratic backsliding. So populism is a phenomenon that we will concentrate on, and is kind of the first topic of our debate. But parallel to this democratic backsliding, we also have been experiencing the erosion of the international world order. While there is no single culprit for this waning of the liberal world order, which was forged after the Second World War, after 1945, and again after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there are several factors that can be considered for this erosion. One is China's increasingly assertive role in the world. Another is Russia's attempt to become increasingly influential and to imbalance or destabilize European democracies. And perhaps worryingly as well, America's role under President Donald Trump in reneging on agreements on climate change, on trade, on issues like Iran, which has also contributed to this trend of erosion of multilateralism. These are huge topics, of course. And on top of these, we have now been struck by a global pandemic. So what this global pandemic begs many questions of these trends that were already ongoing, and that bring us to our session today. So what I would like to do is, given this background, first put the topic of populism, or liberal democracy and populism, to both my speakers. And I think it would be interesting to start by asking, to ask some of these causal factors that might be explaining this rise in populism or this erosion of liberal democracy. And we could start, and I would ask Sheri if she would like to expand on that, on what do you think are the relevant importance of domestic versus international factors in driving the rise of populism and the certain democratic backsliding. So what role do domestic versus international factors play in this trend?
So thank you, Marina, and thank you to all the conference organizers for having me here. So let me start off by saying a few things. I think the two sort of sub-sections of this panel, sort of multilateralism and the state of democracy, I think those two topics are obviously very closely intertwined. As Marina said, there was a new order put in place after the Second World War. In the West, this order had international components, it had regional components, that's European integration, and it had domestic components, that was, so to speak, the formation of social democratic policies and compromises at the level of particular countries' political economies. And all of these things were seen at the time very explicitly by political actors, both in the United States and in Europe, as part of a multi-pronged strategy designed to make democracy work in Western Europe after the Second World War. They were very conscious, of course, of the tragedy of the interwar years, of the rise of fascism, National Socialism, authoritarianism, and therefore of how delicate and fragile democracy was. So the decline of that order that you spoke of, Maria, has to be seen as kind of inexorably intertwined with the problems democracy is facing in Europe and the West today. That said, I think probably the first place to look, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about some of these trends in a little bit more depth, are with a kind of myriad of changes that have been occurring internationally, but it manifested themselves at the domestic level. We've obviously experienced in the West and other parts of the world dramatic economic changes over the past decades. Most countries, my own in particular, have experienced rising levels of inequality, that is to say, growing disparities between the amount of resources that the top levels of the income distribution get and the bottom levels, growing disparity between more dynamic metropolitan areas and more backward rural areas, between people with different educational qualifications. So, all of these things have really created deep divisions, I think, in Western societies, and resentments against an establishment and a political order that seems unable or unwilling to deal with those really problematic economic trends. And on top of that, of course, we've also experienced in the West over the last decades very significant demographic and cultural change. I mean, starting in the 1960s, sort of attacks, so to speak, on traditional values have only accelerated. And of course, demographically, many Western societies over the last decades have really, really changed in very profound ways. I mean, most, or at least many European societies, as well as my own country, now have levels of foreign-born citizens that are at all-time historic highs. And again, this is true even for countries like France and the United States, where immigration is not something new. Still, if you look at the level of foreign-born citizens, they are very high. Now, I mean, I tend to think that is a good thing, but I think what's important to recognize is the level of change has been very rapid. It's combined also with these economic developments, and of course, a whole variety of other things we could talk about: technological change, shifts in the way people communicate, shifts in the way people get their information. And I think cumulatively, what this has done is created a lot of disruption, the sense on the part of a lot of people that the world is changing in ways they neither understand nor like. And perhaps also equally importantly, as I already mentioned, the idea that political elites, the establishment, traditional political parties, their governments are simply unable or unwilling to help them and their societies adjust. This is, so to speak, a kind of perfect storm for parties, populist parties that, you know, blame this establishment, blame immigrants, blame elites for these problems, because these problems are real and they have not really been successfully addressed.
Thanks, Sheri. Let me just ask something that I thought reading a book review on your recent book seemed very interesting to me, was this idea that democratization is a very slow process, and therefore democracy can be under threat, but it takes a really long time for democracy to be overturned and for dictatorship to occur. This idea that these are very long-term trends. And so I would like to ask you whether these threats that populists are threatening the democracies in Europe, but to what extent do you also, given your long-term view that democracy, once it is established and ingrained in a society, is also hard to overturn, would you say that this populism, given the threats that exist, that are international and national, as you mentioned, are you an optimist or a pessimist, given your historic perspective on the way that democracy has evolved in Europe and perhaps differences between countries?
So I would perhaps flip your question around a little bit, which is to say that what is relatively easy from a comparative perspective is getting rid of dictatorships, overthrowing old regimes. What is really hard is building stable democracies. So if we were to look at some of those trends, for instance, that you mentioned, you know, that Freedom House and other groups kind of assess, the fact that countries that recently made transitions to democracy, ones most importantly that have very little previous experience with democracy, that are making transitions to democracy for the first time, that those countries have faced some very significant problems in the last years, historically is not surprising. I mean, if you look at Portugal, Spain, a whole variety of other European countries, we mentioned the reconstruction of democracy after 1945, you know, democratic failures are much more prevalent historically than democratic successes. And particularly when countries have little democratic background, that is to say, limited experience with the institutions and procedures of democracy, the fact that their democratic experiments fail, again, is not historically surprising. What perhaps is a little bit more surprising is what the first question you asked gets towards, which is the problems that are facing, as you said, more established long-term democracies today, right? That in a way is more worrying, because we do expect as political scientists that the longer a democracy has been in place, the harder it is to undermine, simply because, again, those institutions, those procedures, and those norms have been much more firmly anchored in those societies. So that they are now being seriously questioned and weakened is, in fact, in some ways more worrying than when I look across the globe and I see countries that are poor, that are underdeveloped, that have not had previous experiences with democracy, have their democratic experiments falter. That saddens but does not surprise me. What is historically somewhat unusual is to see countries with generations of democratic experience behind them facing severe threats. I would say my own country is probably the the most frightening example of that, not only because our democratic tradition, such as it is quite long, but because the threats are really much greater in the United States, I would say right now, than they are in Western Europe. And you know, what happens in the United States matters.
Can you be more specific about what threats you consider that are exist in the US at the moment?
Well, I mean, on almost any criteria by which you measure the quality of democracy, the United States has experienced significant declines over the past years, particularly during the Trump administration, but not only. Separation of powers, checks and balances, questioning of things like freedom of the press and freedom of organization, use of government institutions and bureaucracies in ways that are clearly corrupt and extremely problematic, the undermining of democratic norms in a whole variety of ways, the unwillingness of political parties to act as a check on egregiously illiberal, if not undemocratic behavior by their own members, a whole variety of things, extreme polarization, that is to say the prevalence in American society of the view that the other side, the other team, the other party is not just a group of people that we disagree with, that we have policy differences with, but are somehow illegitimate and a threat to, to the country. These are extremely dangerous trends. It is very difficult for democracy to function well in the midst of all of these attacks on some of its, again, fundamental institutions and norms.
Thanks, Sheri. Charles, taking on this last point made by Sheri in saying that US democracy is eroding for the criteria that she has now listed, and that this is important not only for the US, but also for the world. And you have published also a book on the importance of the US for Europe and for national democracies. So how do you see this relevance of domestic versus international factors here? What role has the US played? What role is the US playing at the moment for the health of democracies worldwide?
Thank you very much, Marina, and thank you for your kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to join you today and in the company of Sheri Berman, and my follow with enormous interest. Well, I think, as she was pointing out, the most disturbing change that's taken place in recent years is the fact, first of all, that the United States, which was largely responsible for what we have normally called the liberal international order, which is a complex arrangement of institutions, procedures, legislation, and so on, which was created after World War II, and which has provided, I think, very significant global public goods, not only to the United States and its allies, but actually to the whole of the world, or to a very significant part of the world, and which, by the way, had become increasingly inclusive, as is shown by the fact that China and later Russia were invited to join the World Trade Organization, for example. This liberal international order is now crumbling, not so much, we could argue, because it is being challenged by emerging powers such as China or revisionist powers such as Russia, but essentially because its creator, or the country that did most to create it back in the 40s and the 50s, the United States, has basically turned its back on this liberal international order. Again, I don't want to demonize President Trump. Others can do this far more effectively and probably amusingly than I can. But it is undoubtedly true that President Trump has basically turned his back on half a century or more of a very close collaboration and the existence of these institutions. Now, there is an interesting academic debate about the liberal international order and its limitations. Some American scholars are even claiming that the liberal international order never existed, that it was only really a figment of American imagination. Richard Haas, quite entertainingly, has compared this to the French philosophe Voltaire's observation about the Holy Roman Empire, when he said that it was neither holy nor Roman nor much of an empire. And Richard Haas says, well, it's the same. with the ILO, the Liberal International Order. It's not very liberal, it's not really very global, and it's not terribly orderly either. So, and the interesting debate, of course, is, for example, is it true, as some scholars argue, that only when you have a system where the US is hegemonic can you have a multilateral system such as this? In other words, is US hegemony, a benevolent hegemony, if you like, the factor that explains the success of the liberal international order, and therefore is US decline the factor which essentially explains the gradual erosion of this liberal international order? I think the jury is still out on that, and we haven't really come to any conclusions about that. My personal take would be that there is actually a possibility to create or reform the existing liberal international order while at the same time de-Americanizing it. In other words, I think what we have today is essentially a multipolar world with rather weak and unsatisfactory multilateral institutions. And I would argue that for the vast majority of states, whether democratic or otherwise, they have a vested interest in maintaining and guaranteeing the survival of a semblance of international order. It will probably be less liberal. It will probably be thinner. In other words, it will probably affect fewer policy areas, and it will be more fragmented. This is probably inevitable. But I do believe in the survival of some kind of liberal international order, even at a time which will foreseeably be dominated by growing US-China rivalry and ultimately the relative decline of the US and the relative ascendancy of China.
Thanks. I wanted to come back on what you were saying in terms of demonizing President Trump, because with Obama, there was already people considering foreign policy, US foreign policy with Obama. They already noted a shift towards the Pacific, a shift towards concentrating much more on Asia relations due to this growing sense of threat that the US has in relation to China. So to what extent is it Trump, or is it this US economic decline or China's competition with the US that is driving these trends? And so how do you see what could happen with the Biden presidency, i.e. would we get a lot of change, or instead, or not, because this is driven by by the US-China competition rather than Trump specificities? I
think that's a very good question, particularly now that we are only a month away from the next US presidential election. As you rightly point out, the transatlantic relationship had already experienced significant change long before President Trump came to office, not only because of this pivot to Asia, which you referenced, but also essentially because the United States was reconsidering its role as a major power, as a global power, and encouraging its European allies to do so as well. So, for example, it was under President Obama that the US began to demand that its allies in NATO should spend at least 2% of GDP on defense, which very few of us do, as you know. Mm-hmm. The big difference, though, of course, is that President Obama never questioned the existence of NATO or the need for a North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which President Trump has done. President Obama never questioned European integration, which, as Sheri intimated, is in fact a byproduct of this liberal international order, which was built under the US geopolitical umbrella. President Trump in private has described the EU as like China, only smaller. Okay, you can laugh that off, but I think this is quite serious. In other words, he has no fundamental understanding of the EU as one of the pillars of this liberal international order. And of course, he seems to be unaware of the fact because of his Make America Great Again philosophy and his America First philosophy, that we are and will continue to be America's closest partners, both in terms of trade and investment, and also, above all, in terms of our shared values and interests. So, yes.
On that, I would like you to comment on this Trump's particular specificities, that he was in favor of Brexit. I mean, he was often during the Brexit campaign, he explicitly stated that he was in favor of Brexit. So, and he has had very difficult relations with Angela Merkel. And so it seems like he's not just ignoring the EU or not understanding the EU, he's actively against the EU. Do you agree with that, or is that too harsh?
I absolutely agree. I'm currently reading the memoirs of the former British ambassador to Washington, who had to leave his post, basically as a result of a tweeting campaign conducted incredibly by the President of the United States. First of all, Trump flirted with the idea of Britain appointing Nigel Farage as ambassador to Washington, which shows, among other things, that he has no idea of how ambassadorial appointments are conducted in other countries other than his own. But not only that, as you rightly point out, he has tried to undermine European integration by encouraging, not only by encouraging Brexit, but also by encouraging other EU member states to follow the Brexit example. So this is extraordinary. This had never happened. Instead of seeing the EU, as all American presidents in the past have done, as the cornerstone of the transatlantic relationship and a fundamental pillar of this liberal international system, he has actively tried to undermine the EU. He has actively tried to undermine its strongest leader, Angela Merkel, as you said. And he simply does not understand that this is much more than a common market. You know, we are a political union with shared values and interests. And I would stress the values as well as the interests.
Of course. Okay, well, thanks a lot. Let me move on to the next topic, which is concentrating on national democracies and considering the relevant importance of economic versus social and cultural trends. How much of the support for populism and or growing dissatisfaction with democracy can we account for by looking at economic trends, or is it more of or are we talking more about values and cultural change, immigration, like Sheri was saying? But I would like, Sheri Berman, I would like you to take the lead on this. But I wanted you to bring into this discussion your very interesting work on the role of conservatives, the role of the right-wing democratic parties in forging democracies. And I think that populism, because it's mostly right-wing populism across Europe, is a particular challenge for these conservative or Christian democratic parties that were so important for democratization. So how do you see the way in which these parties are responding as helping or hindering the development of populism due to economic or cultural reasons?
Okay, so sort of to pick up parts of the conversation that we had a little bit earlier, I think both of these types of changes, one might broadly consider to be economic changes and then social and cultural changes, I think that these things are somewhat difficult to disentangle, in the sense that, you know, when things like inequality rise, when divisions among, sort of urban and rural areas between more and less educated citizens grow, the potential or the desire or the ease of scapegoating also increases. So, you know, as a political scientist, the literature is very clear that, you know, in times of economic stress and strain, the tendency for anti-immigrant sentiment, for example, rises. When people are worried about the future, when people are seeing problems, they tend to look for, sort of easy causes of them. And especially once you have right-wing populists around, it's very easy to identify minorities or immigrants or whatever as those causes. So, I mean, both of these trends or types of trends, let me say, have been occurring, but I think it's their interaction as well as their interaction with some of the other things that we've discussed, that's really made the situation so politically explosive. Again, you know, when I think about rather the research, it is very clear that there is a strong, as I said, correlation between, you know, rising anti-immigrant sentiment, you know, conflicts, so to speak, between majority and minority populations during times of stress and strain. So I would think about how our particular era is one when we've seen a variety of these disruptive trends come together in ways that have been easy for populists to exploit and difficult for more traditional parties to deal with. And that brings me to the second half of your question, which is the role played by traditional parties. And I would say, looking here both at the traditional left and the traditional right, in Europe, that traditional right is in many places Christian democratic parties, is very important. I mean, one thing to note, that I would note as a political scientist, looking at the data is, you know, you begin to have problems for parties when their profiles, their programs, and their policies begin to get significantly out of whack with the underlying preferences of voters. And so one of the things we can see, for instance, with regard to the trends that we were just talking about, is that Christian democratic parties in many places began to advocate policies on social and cultural issues that were somewhat out of touch, so to speak, with the preferences of underlying voters. And a similar trend happened on the left, right, which is a lot of traditionally left parties, social democratic parties, labor parties in Britain under Blair, began to advocate policies, economic policies, that were also out of whack with the underlying preferences of their voters. Both.
Can I just say something? So yeah. I guess that when you speak about social democratic parties being out of touch with their electorate, it's because they are rather more cosmopolitan than the social democratic militants or base.
Well, but that's true. Actually, it is perhaps most obviously true with parties of the left, who in an earlier era would have had a much more class-focused profile, whose leaders might very well have either come from the working class or been members of unions or other kinds of traditional left-wing organizations. And by the end of the 20th century, these parties were led by, you know, cosmopolitan, highly educated elites, probably like the people who are, you know, sitting in this seminar today. But that is also, yeah.
Sorry, you were going to say, what are the differences between the Christian democratic elite and their base? Because that is less clear to me.
So if you look at some Christian democratic parties, and I think the German case is particularly instructive here, although this was also true, for instance, under Cameron in Britain and some parties in Scandinavia as well. You did see, I mean, look, the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, you know, this was a party that existed for quite a while, for several years before the refugee crisis in Germany. And it got some support, but relatively little. Its support exploded once Merkel made that decision in 2015 to open the borders. Now, I'm not saying we should think it was a bad decision. What I am saying is it opened an opportunity for them to exploit an issue that, in fact, they had not been as focused on before. This was an anti-EU party in some ways. This was a party that was focused on a variety of issues, and it very quickly became an anti-immigrant first party because it was able to exploit that decision. There was a very, you know, sort of infamous statement made many years ago by the head of the Bavarian wing of the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, the CSU, Franz Joseph Strauss, who said that there could never be a party to the right of the CDU, CSU in Germany, that could not be allowed. And he meant that for a variety of reasons, but underneath that was a very important recognition about what it takes to make democracy work in Europe. It takes two parties or traditional parties that push towards the center, right? And so the CDU, CSU had to be the home of conservative voters, and that if it stopped being so, that opening up that space on the right could create very dangerous political dynamics. And so that is part of that story, right? Which is that conservative voters started fleeing both of the traditional parties, and largely on the basis of concerns about social and cultural issues. So that's, that is something that needs to be thought about, which is not to say that that leads to an anti-immigrant stance, but it does lead to recognizing that those fears or concerns are there, and that ignoring them or poo-pooing them, calling people deplorables, in other words, because they fear social and cultural change, is not a way to make them understand that those kinds of things are not threats to them, but opportunities for them and the country. Politicians need to speak to voters' fears and concerns, not denigrate them.
Thanks, Sheri, very much for your response. And I would ask Charles the same thing. So, how do you see this importance of economic versus social and cultural trends? I think that it's. I can very clearly see what Sheri was saying is that these things are very correlated. If you are economically deprived, you have tendency to scapegoat certain groups, and it could be immigrants. But it's interesting that also it has been seen that, for instance, in Eastern Europe, you've had actually a lot of economic growth, and you have the rise of extreme right populism in places like Poland, which has seen growth that Portugal can only envy, and they don't have any immigration practice. I mean, they don't have a lot of immigrants. So what is not everything, I would say, can be reduced, unfortunately, I think, because I think economic factors are more easily solved in politics is much better at solving economic issues than it is about solving cultural and nationalist type issues. So how do you see these factors playing out in Europe today, Charles?
Thank you. And I'm going to pick up specifically on your last remark about the fact that economic grievances in theory are easier to deal with than cultural grievances. If I look back over the last 10 years or so, and more recently over the last 5 years in the context of Brexit in particular, I'm immediately reminded of a book by David Goodhart, which many of you will have read, which was very controversial, The Road to Somewhere, in which he basically divided society into three groups. Somewheres, in other words, the people who are grounded, who have a sense of community. Anywheres, cosmopolitans, who basically can live anywhere, can adapt to different environments because they're sophisticated, etc. And the in-betweeners. And he essentially saw this division, which of course is highly debatable, in terms of different value tribes. In other words, in terms of cultural elements. But one of the reasons why this book was so controversial, of course, is because when he addressed the preferences and the fears of the somewheres, somewheres complain that when they go out into the street, they no longer recognize the city they live in. And whether we like it or not, we're basically talking about racism, because we're basically talking about immigration, right? So yes, that there is a cultural component there. And as you were saying, Poland is fascinating because it has strong economic growth, although it has to be said that the cities are benefiting much more from this growth. The urban centers, which are connected to Europe and to Germany in particular, much more than the rural voters. And of course, it's the rural voters who tend to vote for these right-wing, predominantly right-wing Catholic candidates. There's been a recent book, which I strongly recommend, by Martin Sandbu, called The Economics of Belonging, A Radical Plan to Win Back the Left Behind and Achieve Prosperity for All. And his argument is, it's not about culture, it's about economics. And it's basically about technology. It's basically about the disruptive impact of technology on the Rust Belt in the States, or the declining industrial sectors in Northern Europe, and so on. So it's basically technology more than about globalization, although of course you could argue that technology and globalization to some extent also go hand in hand. So I take heart from this book, because The argument here is that it's essentially about economics and it's essentially about inequality. I think if we look at all of the major studies that have been conducted in most of our societies, look at Italy in particular, practically flat growth for 20 years and growing inequality as a result of the 2008 recession, and even more now as a result of the pandemic. So I think we have to balance these two analyses. And of course, culture and economics go hand in hand to some extent, because ultimately, of course, immigration is essentially economically motivated.
Thanks. Thank you very much to both. I would I would like to move on from this topic, because we don't have that much time, and to consider the multilateralism, and in particular, I would like to ask both of you about Europe's role in this ability to rise to the challenge of an increasingly insular United States. I mean, we have discussed how the United States is withdrawing from this multilateral international order that it forged, it led, and there is always the eternal question of whether the European Union will be able to rise up to this challenge and really take a lead on different areas, economic, security, defense-wise, in the world. Are there signs that this is happening, or is it? What is your impression in terms of the role that the EU is playing? And Charles, would you want to take the lead on that, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I could bore you to death on this topic. I've always been quite sanguine about the future of European integration. And of course, European integration is apparently dull, it's complex, and it doesn't normally get a very good press. But let me remind you of one thing. In connection with our previous debate about populism, last year we had elections to the European Parliament in May. And I remember a lot of pundits and commentators basically saying, this is the end of Europe, it's the end of the European Parliament, because there's going to be a very large block of Eurosceptic, racist lunatics who will stand in the way of European integration and indeed of anything sensible that the European Parliament wants to put forward. It hasn't happened. Let me also say, by the way, I'm not underestimating the threat of populism, but let me also say that of the 27 EU member states, in 12, there are either no far-right populist parties, or when they do exist, they win less than 10% of the vote. In 10 more, including Germany and France, they are consistently excluded from office by mainstream parties. So basically we have Hungary and Poland, and we have 3 more countries where you have national governments with ultra-right-wing parties in coalition, namely Latvia, Estonia, and Bulgaria. We can add Spain if you like, if we categorize Podemos as a left-wing, radical left-wing populist movement, which I think one can. Then there are 4 countries which have coalition governments that include populist governments. So, as far as the pandemic is concerned, and the impact of the pandemic, and the impact of the current state of the international liberal order. Before the pandemic started, the European Union was already trying to come to terms with this context. I think we have to acknowledge that the next 30, 40 years will be dominated by this increasingly worrying rivalry between China and the US. And the EU has very gradually and slowly tried to come to terms with this. Let's not forget this new commission, which came into power earlier this year, was described by its president, Ursula von Leyen, as a geopolitical commission. Okay, so this is the first time that the commission, which is supposedly basically there to make sure that the treaties are respected and so on, is actually talking in geopolitical terms. The Spaniard Josep Borrell recently appointed HRVP, High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, and the person responsible for EU foreign policy. has reminded us in rather blunt and perhaps surprising and controversial terms that the EU has to learn how to speak the language of power. In other words, the EU has to get real about the geopolitical circumstances in which it operates. Now, for some Europeanists, federalists, find this actually quite disturbing. They don't want to talk the language of power because, according to them, the EU was created precisely so as not to have to worry about power, politics, and so on, and spheres of influence, which sounded dreadfully old-fashioned in the 19th century. But whether we like it or not, in this context of traditional great power rivalry, the EU is finally, I think, coming to terms with this challenge. So what's actually going on? Well, again, before the pandemic, we were talking about strategic autonomy. This was the buzzword. This was the fancy new term. Now, strategic autonomy a year ago or 2 years ago was mainly used to describe how Europe needs to take its defense and security more seriously. Now we're doing much more than that. We are applying the principle of strategic autonomy to, for example, perhaps the need for greater significant reindustrialization, technological autonomy, digital autonomy, autonomy in the field of cybersecurity, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, I think the EU is coming to terms with the fact that it cannot simply be collateral damage in the growing conflict between China and the US. And the only way to prevent that from happening is, first of all, closer integration. Of course, that will always pose certain problems in some countries which are more reluctant to pursue that goal. But I think the pandemic has helped us in this sense, and helped us to realize that without closer integration, we will perform less well. And secondly, it's not about choosing between the US and China. Obviously, we will always be much closer to the US because the US and Europe continue to share, in spite of the Trump administration, continue to share fundamental values and interests. The point, though, is that we have to be credible as a global actor. This is something that has been lacking, but after all, European integration has always advanced in times of crisis. So first of all, we are going to integrate more deeply, I think, on the economic front. This remarkable next generation EU package, which is worth 672 billion euros, basically opens the door to debt mutualization. And this is a major step forward for European integration. So on the one hand, we will have closer European economic integration, monetary integration, economic integration. And at the same time, I think we are finally getting real about the need to act as a global player on the world stage.
Thanks. Let me just say we have 156 attendees to this panel live with us, which is, I think, pretty great. So let's continue, and I'll ask Sheri if she shares this very benign, positive, and optimistic view that Charles Powell has on the EU's role, or are you more of a skeptic, considering, for instance, that the EU does not, very rarely intervenes in the countries with which it borders or near borders, where things are happening in Belarus, things are happening there was the annexation of Crimea. I mean, I could go on, and there is simply no action from the EU. We speak about the Middle East and North Africa, etc. So do you also share this positive view, or are you more of a skeptic, Sheri Berman?
So I think here actually may be a place where Charles and I have somewhat divergent views. I mean, I would like nothing more than Europe to be able to step up and take over some of the roles that the United States had played, but I have been really disappointed with its ability and perhaps even willingness to do so. I mean, it hasn't even been able to take any effective measures against democratic backsliding within its own borders. I mean, given, as we said before, that European integration was part of a multi-pronged strategy designed to stabilize democracy in Europe, it played that role extremely effectively up through the 20th century, including in places like Portugal and Spain. And now it has been essentially powerless to stop that process in places like Hungary and Poland. That is dispiriting. It has also been unable to do anything, as you said, about looming international threats, including those that are right on its borders. So this is not this is not something that makes me optimistic or happy, particularly again against the backdrop of a United States that, especially under Trump, but not only under Trump, has increasingly withdrawn from you know, its international role. So I am very, very concerned about that. I would also like to take up one other point that Charles made, that I would look at the glass as half empty as opposed to half full. It is, of course, true, as Charles said, that populists, right or left wing, are not in power in many places, but their ability to disrupt and undermine democracy has been really great. I mean, really great, not only because obviously they've shifted the agenda in a lot of places, but they've made it almost impossible to form stable governments in a whole variety of countries. In places like Germany or Sweden, where they have been purposefully excluded from power, perhaps correctly so, it has made forming stable coalition governments extremely difficult simply because the votes are not there. And that in turn, without those stable, strong governments, it's very difficult for these countries to deal with the challenges that they face. So yes, it is true, thank goodness, that we've not had particularly right-wing populists in power in a lot of places, but their disruptive capacity, their ability to weaken democracy has nonetheless really grown, I would say, dramatically over the past decade. And that is something that we need to keep in mind, even though, as Charles points out, it is the case that they have not governed in or been included in governing coalitions in very many European countries. This is also, of course, true at the European level, where, yes, you know, some pundits were expecting an even greater apocalypse after the last European elections, but let's be clear, their vote shares have continued to grow. And when you have, you know, a quarter to a third of your deputies who are at least ostensibly opposed to the very institution they are a part of, you know, there's problems. It makes dealing with other challenges much more difficult.
I have to ask you some questions that are from the audience, because I promised to do that. But before I do so, I wanted to ask Charles to come back on what Sheri Berman just said, Charles. And I also wanted to ask you very much to respond to that by also referring your immense knowledge of Spain. How do you see the Spanish political process at the moment in relation to populism, populist parties that exist on the left and on the right?
Sure.
Is polarization that is occurring due to their emergence and their dynamic, or, I mean, this would be another seminar, but if you could briefly also give a bit of input to how you see this process, that would be really great.
Sure, those are very good questions. No, I agree with part of what Sheri said, and I think the most important point is that what really matters is not so much whether the populists are in power or not, it's how they contaminate other parties which are in power. And this takes me directly to the Spanish case. You know, we have a traditional center-right party, the Popular Party, which is constantly looking over its shoulder because in the last elections in November, Vox, the far-right party, was the third largest party. They won 15% of the vote. And similarly, we have a traditional, highly successful social democratic party, the PSOE, which is constantly looking over its shoulder to see what Podemos are doing. This, of course, raises an interesting question, which we haven't had time to address directly, which is how do you best counteract populism? Do you exclude them or do you include them? Now, the Spanish experience may be interesting. I think it was probably a good idea to bring Podemos into Spain's first coalition government ever since 1978, that is, because, you know, to some extent, people are realizing that being in office is complicated, it involves compromises, et cetera, and of course, at the same time, by excluding these parties, you are giving them the monopoly of opposition. You know, so in a sense, the shift from protest to power is a very interesting one, and one which I think normally undermines populist organizations. The same happened to the wonderfully named True Finns back in 2017. So, you know, I'm actually quite optimistic in that sense. I think that obviously the Spanish political system is under severe stress. There are 20 political parties in the Spanish parliament. more than ever before. And this is also the most highly polarized political context, I think, that we've ever had in the last 30, 40 years. But nevertheless, you know, both political leaders and public opinion are becoming accustomed to what is effectively now a four-party system rather than a two-party system. And as we were saying right at the beginning, Spanish democracy perhaps is more resilient than people often realize.
Thanks. Great. I've been looking at the questions that were asked, and actually we've been discussing a lot of the topics that that were in the questions, namely about cultural values and whether they are standalone or correlated with economic issues, and also lots of questions about the role of Europe. So I think that we can consider that these have been discussed. So the last final question that we have here is about the pandemic. Charles has already mentioned the pandemic and in relation to the EU, but I would like to get both of your views, and starting with Sheri Berman, on do you see the pandemic as a game changer, or is it just reinforcing pre-existing trends? Is it going to expose the inefficacies of the opportunism of populists who are not effective at governing, or on the contrary, do you have a more negative perspective in terms of the long-term consequences that it might bring to liberal democracy? And this question to both of you. Thanks.
Great. Well, I mean, let me take a couple of different aspects of that question. The first is, I think what the pandemic has done extremely effectively is to highlight or to further reveal the weaknesses inherent in many systems, both democratic and authoritarian, I would say. I mean, if you look at the way the pandemic originated, the pathologies of Chinese authoritarianism are very clear, right? The cover-ups, the unwillingness to share information, the desire to please higher ups rather than respond to the needs of citizens. That the pandemic exploded the way it did can't be separated from the nature of China's authoritarian system. On the other hand, some democracies have done really badly in dealing with the pandemic as well. And my own country has to, you know, be at the top of that list. So, I mean, one thing the pandemic has done is reveal weaknesses of systems that we probably knew were there, but we're not paying full attention to. So that's one interesting political consequence of the pandemic. As for its long-term impact on politics in democracies in particular, I would say that it's one way to think about this is to trace it back to some of the dynamics or discussions we were having earlier, which is in countries like Germany, for instance, where the government has proven to be sane and relatively effective, it has actually managed to push off the agenda some of the other issues that were dominating politics, and particularly those that play to the benefit of populists, most importantly, immigration, right? And so Merkel's ability to kind of handle this crisis calmly and effectively, right, has made the AfD look bad, because it's not only that she's done a good job, it's that people's attention is not focused on the issue that they most directly benefit from, which is immigration, right? So one of the things that the pandemic has also done is highlighted, I think, the kinds of conditions in which populists thrive. When existing parties seem to be inefficient, unwilling to deal with challenges, and when things like immigration are at the top of the agenda. And so, you know, if we were to see a situation going forward where, again, you know, some countries manage to emerge from this crisis obviously better off than others, I think the establishment, and establishment political parties perhaps is the better way to put it, will emerge stronger and therefore populists weaker. In places where countries, where the parties in power have proved to be inept and inefficient, I would expect populists to derive much benefit from that. And I worry about the Spanish case, for instance, in that regard.
Okay, thanks a lot. Over to you, Charles. Very briefly, please.
Yeah, I basically agree with the notion that there's no direct correlation between regime type and ability to respond to the pandemic. Some democracies have done really well, many of the Scandinavian ones, for example. Some have not done so well. I can't think of any populist regime that's done terribly well, though. I think all the populists who have tended to turn their backs on the science have probably paid a very high price. So this may have some salutary long-term effects in showing people that having populist leaders can be dangerous. I think it's also, it's not a game changer. I don't see the pandemic as a game changer. To go back to your question, I think it's basically accelerated trends that already existed there. In other words, it's accelerated the unraveling of the liberal international order and the weakening of the multilateral system. At the same time, though, this may have an upside, which is that people have realized that institutions like the WHO, the World Health Organization, are far too weak. I'm very pleased to see that Boris Johnson has announced that Britain will be increasing its contributions to the WHO by 30%, and the UK will thereby become the largest contributor to the WHO, by the way. So maybe if Trump is leaving, at least someone else is stepping up to the plate. And finally, of course, what we aren't seeing, sadly, is a global response to this. We haven't had a global response to the pandemic. We haven't had a global response to the production of a new vaccine. By the way, that'll be the next hurdle, of course, because probably once vaccines actually exist, this will unleash another storm of national rivalry and international tension. So sadly, I think the pandemic will not have contributed to the reform of the multilateral system, but at least I think it will have been a wake-up call for many of our citizens.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So we've reached the end of our panel. We've reached the end of our session. I have to say, I really had a great time. I really enjoyed speaking to both our speakers who were so brilliant, and I hope everyone enjoyed the panel as well. And now I will turn it over to Fernando Jorge Cardoso, who will take on from here. Thanks to both of you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.